Hello and welcome everyone to New Media Mixer, a new web event series by Swissnex in New York. I'm your host, Oliver Haugen, the head of Swissnex in New York. Today we will be joined by Nick Newman and Lauren Ober, who I will introduce shortly. And the topic of discussion will be the state of podcasting in the US and Europe. Just a few words about what we're doing here. For the next few months, we will be hosting conversations with experts in various areas of emerging media. These are meant to be free-flowing, they're meant to be fast-paced and interactive. So we encourage you to ask questions using the Q&A box, and that's not the chat box, it's the Q&A box in Zoom. And we will also feature a couple short polls to get the mood of the virtual room about these topics. So before diving headfirst into the topics, here's a little bit about us. Swissnex in New York and Swissnex Boston are an initiative of Switzerland's State Secretariat for Education, Research and Innovation. We're effectively the world's first science and innovation consulate, and Swissnex aims to accelerate the exchange of knowledge between Switzerland and the fast-growing tech and research ecosystems that are around the world. We were founded in Boston in 2000, so we're celebrating our 20th anniversary this year. And we have major outposts in San Francisco, in Shanghai, in Bangalore, and Rio de Janeiro. And our interest in media is part of a broader focus in the last couple of years on training and prototyping in emerging media through our Swissnex Labs program. You can learn a little bit more about that program online. I can tell you that the first edition took place in early 2020, and it was focused on podcasting. The next edition, which will be virtual, will focus on augmented and virtual reality. Our website, if you want to have a little bit more detail about these programs, is swissnexlabsnewyork.com. So today's mixer will focus on the state of podcasting, and we will cover three broad topics: the current trends in podcasting in 2020 and the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. The second topic will be differences between the US and Europe, especially around genres of podcasting, production, and monetization. And the third topic is, what does the future of podcasting look like? So for today's conversation, I'm delighted to be joined by Lauren Ober and Nick Newman. Lauren Ober is the host and producer of Spectacular Failures, a new podcast. Well, actually, it's on its second season, which dropped, I think, a few days ago. And prior to that, she hosted and produced NPR's The Big Listen. In a life before hosting podcasts, Lauren was an award-winning public radio reporter, producing stories for outlets like NPR, 99% Invisible, and Criminal. Lauren once won a regional Emmy and is hoping to nab an elusive regional EGOT. She'll have to tell us what that is before she dies. She's a graduate of the Transom Story Workshop of Syracuse University and American University. And I think you're a proud Pittsburgh native, and you're currently living in what you call the 51st state, which I guess refers to Washington, D.C. Nick Newman joins us from London. He's a senior research associate at the Reuters Institute of the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism at the University of Oxford. And he's also the lead author of the Digital News Report 2020, which is a very comprehensive survey that I encourage you to visit and read. You're a journalist and a digital strategist who played a key role in shaping the BBC's internet services for over a decade. You were a founding member of the BBC News website, and you led international coverage as world editor from 1997 to 2001. And as head of product development for BBC News, you helped introduce innovations such as blogs, podcasting, and on-demand video. You live in London, as I mentioned, so it's great to have at least two, actually three time zones represented if we add our podcast fans and aficionados that are based in Switzerland. So I'd like to start by asking both Nick and Lauren what it is that they've been focusing on these past few months. Let's start with you, Lauren.
Thank you first, Oliver, for having me, and for Swissnex for inviting me. It's really fun to talk to international audiences about podcasting. I think when you live in the US, you think that everything revolves around you, which is not true. There is a very wide world out there. And so I'm happy to have the opportunity to chat about what we do to folks who maybe don't live in the US. What have I been working on? So I host a show for American Public Media called Spectacular Failures. We just launched our second season. It's a business show. It's a narrative business podcast all about big business collapses. So last season we looked at Kodak. We looked at the savings and loan crisis in the US. We looked at Donald Trump's Atlantic City casinos. And this season we have a full slate of shows that we're in production on. We just launched season 2 on Monday. We have 2 more episodes that we're producing right now. So we're in the home stretch of things. It's a 10-episode season. I guess it's, they take 9 months to produce or so. So we only kind of eke out one a year, but that's what I've been working on, and nothing else, sadly.
Wonderful. Well, congratulations on the second season. And Nick, you've also just released recently with your colleagues something.
Yeah, so great to be here as well and to be part of this discussion. I'm a huge fan of audio, podcasting. I used to be a radio producer going back many years, and my first love was always audio. So it's amazingly exciting to see this sort of revival and sort of younger people getting to really experience audio. So I've been promoting the Digital News Report. It's the largest survey of international news consumption in the world. We've been running it since 2012. This year we did 40 countries, polled 80,000 people. And currently I'm looking at sort of how we expand that to more countries. And then relating to podcasting, in the last year, I've also done a lot of work on the supply side, which was fascinating, looking at podcast strategies of major media companies in the news space, everyone from the New York Times to the BBC, to publishers, print publishers all over Europe as well. And I'm actually just doing a follow-up on that right now. So again, speaking to publishers about how the COVID crisis affected podcasting, and particularly around news. So that's what I'm focusing on.
Excellent. Well, that allows us to dive into our first topic, which is some of the major trends that we've seen in 2020 and the impact of the lockdown. So, Nick, broadly speaking, what are some of the global trends that you've noticed from your comprehensive survey and study in the Digital News Report this year?
Yeah, it's actually hard to get a picture of podcasting because it's quite hard to define it in itself, but also internationally, people have slightly different meanings about what the word podcast means slightly different things. But in general, we ask the same question every year and we see year-on-year growth. So it's one of the few areas that is continuing to grow. Huge interest in specific genres, like news, for example, has really exploded in the last few years, in particular with COVID. One of the really interesting things is the way in which podcast is really appealing to younger people. So in the UK, for example, half of all podcasts are listened to by under 35s. And they make quite a small proportion of people, and they're listening for long periods of time. And this year, the other thing we've really looked at is the changing platforms. So it used to be completely dominated by Apple. And the demographic was also shaped by Apple. That's changing because of the emergence of Spotify, the fact that podcasts are now emerging in search results through Google, voice-activated devices. So we're seeing podcasting really reaching out to different demographics and audiences. And I think that's part of the sort of the growth story as well that we're seeing right now.
Mm-hmm. Actually, I was looking at this. You published a page on various countries, and Switzerland is listed as having 32% of those surveyed listening to podcasts in the last month. Is that relatively similar to what we've seen elsewhere in Europe and in the US, for that matter?
Actually, around a third say that they consume the podcast across 20 countries that we polled on podcasts specifically. So Switzerland's slightly above the average. The US is one of the key leaders. And that's not just in terms of percentages, but it's also in terms of sophistication of the market. We'll talk about that later. Interestingly, other countries like Germany are consuming fewer podcasts, significantly fewer podcasts. Now, that may just be because of language, and actually they're consuming a lot of on-demand radio, or it may just be because the radio is so strong that actually less room for disruption of podcast. So I think we also see some of those trends in the UK where the BBC is so strong that there's less room for some of the newer diverse voices, less call for it.
And of course, countries are at various stages of development in their approach to podcasting, both from a listenership standpoint, but also from a production standpoint. I'm curious, Lauren, from your perspective, how much you've seen the podcasting space change since the days, of the Big Listen, or even before that, when you were sort of still in print journalism and exploring the possibility of podcasts.
Right. I mean, I think that when I first sort of landed on podcasts was maybe 2010, and they were radio shows that were then broadcast digitally. So it was a Radio Lab and a This American Life and Freakonomics, the sort of standard bearers of the medium, and that piqued my interest, and that's sort of how I was a listener, and I was interested in, how do you even make this thing? And sort of as I was learning to make radio, the whole industry sort of changed in a matter of just a handful of years. I mean, I moved from print to radio in 2012, and then probably just a few years after that, I mean, I would say, 2015, around then, 2014, it just sort of felt like it was blowing up. And public radio stations, public radio distributors in the US, National Public Radio, NPR, were sort of leading that. And then also sort of larger public media outlets like WNYC in New York, WBEZ in Chicago, they were all very strong producers and putting things out there into the world. And it just felt like a sea change. I mean, when I sort of finished my radio training in 2012, I was worried that I wouldn't be able to get a job. And then just sort of 2 years later, 3 years later, you couldn't, it's hard now to find producers, actually, because there's so many people who already have great jobs. I mean, they're employed. It's interesting to see how it's become it's gone from niche to fairly popular. I mean, a third to me seems like a lot of people doing anything, but if you look at it in terms of other media, everybody watches movies, right? Mm-hmm. Everybody watches TV. So we're not there yet. But it's definitely changed. It's changed in terms of the complexion of the shows, the type of shows that are out there, the complexity of them, the types of technology that's being used. It's really, it's become much more professionalized. And you see that both in the content side and the business side.
Mm-hmm. In terms of finding new ears, so there still seems to be room. There's still people who are not listening to podcasts. But what have been some of the practices you've seen in the last year or two in terms of trying to grow the audience? Do you try to grow the audience that you already have by having them listen to more hours, or are you trying to find new people?
Gosh, Nick, you might have a better understanding of that side of things. I mean, I know what we do in our shop, and I can explain that, but in a more global sense, Nick might be the better one.
I'm also interested in what you do on a personal sense, because I think the micro is also interesting for people. But on a macro level, this is the problem, right? I mean, there's now in the Apple directory over 1 million podcasts. They announced that a few months ago, and similarly, Spotify now has more than 1 million podcasts, and that's made up of the professionalization that Lauren was talking about, but also this sort of incredibly long tail of people who just got a microphone and now have the access to broadcast this. So this has created huge diversity, but it's also left a massive problem in finding audiences and finding new audiences. And if you talk to any podcaster, professional or not, that's sort of almost their number one thing. How do they find audiences? How do they grow audiences? And the truth is that there aren't very many good mechanisms for this. So a lot of it is word of mouth, and you probably know this, is that people, the ones you listen to, a little bit like Netflix movies, are the ones that your friends tell you about. So word of mouth remains incredibly important. I think we are seeing Spotify and others really trying to use their expertise in music discovery now, and Pandora and others, and applying those, because Apple didn't really try. They didn't really make much effort. And so we're starting to see algorithmic discovery, we're starting to see word of mouth discovery, and we're starting to see a lot more in podcast discovery as well. So more networks. So somebody like Vox, for example, media in the US has around 200 podcasts. It has a network of podcasts, and then it's promoting new podcasts through that huge audience that it's built up. So I think the sort of the networks and the power of networks, which again is much more sophisticated in the US than it is in Europe, is really one way in which people are finding new audiences. But what about the micro, Lauren?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think a lot of what you said applies to my specific show. We have found that when we do sort of promo trades with other shows, shows that we might have some affinity with, but that aren't exactly, sort of what we do, we find a big lift from that. So, they run an ad on our show, we run an ad on their show. We have found huge boosts when I personally have been guests on other a guest on other shows. I mean, these are the sort of retail things that you have to do, in addition to, making sure that your show is in all the platforms and, like Nick said, this sort of algorithmic discovery there. But I think in a sort of retail hand-to-hand kind of way, I mean, a lot of it is, that kind of word of mouth. You hear about a show on a show you already like, or increasingly there are podcasts about podcasts. I mean, I hosted one of the first shows on NPR that that was about the medium. It was a little early for its time because it's still very much evolving, but I think that was a little bit of a discovery tool, but it's really a crapshoot. I mean, there aren't a ton of people, compared to how many people write about movies or TV, there aren't a ton of people writing critically about podcasting. And so sort of knowing where to go is hard. And as Nick said, when you have a million podcasts just pouring out at you, from Apple or Spotify, it's like, oh, what do I do? How can I break through that noise? And it's really hard. Like, I wish I could sugarcoat it and say that it's not hard, but it really is. And it helps if you have a network behind you, like I do. It's very hard if you're an independent person to get more than a handful of listens, honestly. And it's a very hard medium. I think I liken it a lot to blogs. Like, in the early days, everybody had a blog, right? Who didn't have a blog? Your grandma had a blog. And then people realized writing is hard. And I think we've seen that a lot in podcasting, which I'm like, do your thing, make a podcast, but it is actually work. And so a lot of shows don't get beyond 3 episodes in Apple or whatever, because it's a huge lift. And getting an audience is just, if Nick and I knew the answer to that, if there was a definitive answer, like, we would be so rich.
Well, let's all hope that fortunes come to both of you with respect to podcasts. I had a question about, so one of the things you're describing is the multiplicity of skill sets that are now involved in producing an effective podcast, and things that the traditional, perhaps more traditional journalists have had to embody new types of roles in addition to their roles as journalists. I'm wondering, since the podcast medium is also one where you have such a large number of independents and people coming into the space that do not necessarily have the same type of journalistic background, what are some of the advantages and disadvantages of that, and what have you learned perhaps from some people that were not at all the same type of background as you have had, Lauren?
Gosh, that's a really interesting question, and I think it's one that we struggle with a lot. Particularly, I do as a journalist. I very I very strongly identify as a journalist, and every bit of work that we do is fact checked, and it goes through a lawyer, and we have very strict, strenuous processes for our research. There are a lot of shows out there that are not made by journalists, but are about something that appeared in the news, right? And it's hard because some people don't take conflict of interest seriously, or some people don't have the same sense of, sort of integrity that a journalist might. Now, I might, be thinking very highly of myself as a journalist, but I do feel like that's important. However, what I make is this interesting blend of journalism and entertainment. Like, let's be real, right? And so what you need in that sense is you need people who are creative and engaged, and who can do great sound design, and who can create, cinematic soundscapes and make you feel like you're in this place. And a lot of straight up journalists don't have that skill set. And so there's had to be a marrying, I think, at least on the narrative side of things. But that is not what most podcasts are. I think most podcasts are chat shows for the most part, right? So what we do is it's very highly produced, and it requires multiple producers who have skill sets and, who have deep knowledge of Pro Tools, for example, or understanding how to sound design and all that. But, that's not most podcasts out there. And that's fine. Like, it's a lot of work, and they're very expensive to make.
The things you describe speak to the very sort of intimate relationship that you create as a podcast producer with the listener. You're effectively in their ears at any given moment when they decide to listen to you. At the same time, these types of relationships that you create through the earbuds are affected by what they're doing at any point during the day. And we've seen a period where everyone's daily routine has changed quite a lot. So I'm going to dive into briefly a little bit the COVID impact on podcasting. And to do so, I'm also going to ask that my colleague will bring up a poll that we'd like to ask our viewers and listeners to respond to, which is essentially, have you been listening to more or to fewer hours of podcasting during the time of COVID? And there's also the option to say that you've been listening to about the same amount. So that's going to be our first question. We'll look at the results shortly. While some of you are still voting, I'm going to ask both of you, let's start with Nick, how has the impact of the COVID pandemic been seen on podcast listening and on habits, and what kind of data do you already have on that?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things I'm looking at the moment. And, as you would expect, the lockdowns meant that the commute disappeared. And the commute was a main way people listen to podcasts. Many podcasts like the New York Times Daily was made, for the length of the average commute, sort of 25 minutes or so. And that's where you have huge listeners. So the peak was somewhere between 7 and 9 in the morning. And then again, there was in the afternoon. Post, for example, with Post Reports was trying to hit. And what you've seen is the flattening of that peak. So the peak now starts in many of the countries that we've looked at, sort of between around 9 and 11. So people are either getting up later or listening to it later, but they're kind of listening when it's convenient during the day. So I don't know, lockdown walks or going to do some getting your exercise. These would be some of the new moments. What's interesting in terms of the volumes, we're going to see, I'm interested to see what your poll says. Personally, I'm listening to fewer podcasts because I listen to a lot on the commute, which is lost.
Same
but
here.
With news in particular, is actually news grew because everyone was so interested in coronavirus. You had a whole load of pop-up coronavirus podcasts created, which have been huge successes. I mean, NPR in the States, you had an amazing German one with a epidemiologist who advises Merkel doing this sort of weekly podcast. So you were getting it from the same person who was advising the Chancellor of Germany. And so you've got this, there's a Gupta podcast from CNN, BBC's been doing coronavirus, ABC's been doing the same. So that has increased the news genre, whereas other genres have completely tanked. You know, like sport, there was no live sports, so sports podcasts tanked. Travel podcasts are obviously not a big thing right now. So genre-wise, you've seen big differences and big changes, but news broadly, for most people, has grown, but the times of listening have changed.
We'll be asking a question on the different genres in a few minutes. Lauren, anecdotally, have you been listening to more or fewer podcasts, and have your taste changed over the time of COVID?
Yeah, you know, I used to be a professional listener, and so I never listened for fun ever. And it took me a really long time to get back into listening for fun. And I think that Corona times, like, I am beaten down by the news. Living in the US right now is a challenge, given the state of our public health crisis. And I can't listen to one more bit of news. And so I listen to a lot of narrative shows, a lot of shows about scams and grifts, and, you know, and they, like, no one gets hurt physically and it all ends up fine in the end. And I found that it actually is lovely to have something to sort of take my mind off of, like, of what's happening. You know, it's interesting, in my own shop, we saw a little bit of a sort of wave like this with, you know, first podcast dropped off, you know, precipitously, and then they went up again, and then they kind of tanked back down. Like, I feel like where the US is just sort of emotionally, like, we haven't landed in a place, or maybe now we've landed in a place of submission where we're all just beaten down, and we can't, like, listen or watch anything anymore. I don't know. But it is interesting. Actually, I was wondering, Nick, commuting obviously is huge here in the US. We drive a lot, but I'm wondering in Europe and countries that you've looked at, like, how big of an issue is commuting in terms of, you know, like, I always think of people like just sitting on the train for 15 minutes and then they're at work, you know, in Europe.
The commutes tend to be less, and people are using public transport more. And, you know, in some European countries, they're using bicycles a lot more. So you're in the car a lot more, and your commute is generally longer. And that's why you've seen radio listening in the US, you know, really suffer during the coronavirus crisis, because that morning commute and that time in the car is gone. But actually, it's been interesting that podcast hasn't been affected quite as much, I think. Mm-hmm. But there's still a massive peak, and it is, you know, it's still a substantial peak, you know, a substantial commute for many people.
Well, we have some results here, I believe. It seems that, okay, people are listening to more podcasts every week. That's not by a large margin. Well, 56%. That's not bad. So there's hope. I'm wondering, as we sort of segue into the second topic, which is sort of differences between the US and Europe. And of course, on that specific question, there might be some differences as Europeans have started going back into the offices a slightly more at a slightly faster clip than here in the US. So we will have a second poll. It's actually a two-part poll. It might take a little while for you to answer it, but we're going to ask you about the different genres of podcasts that you've been listening to during COVID. And it's because of the length of the different types of options, it's going to be in two parts. So there'll be 10 answers possible in the first one and 9 in the second one. And you can answer as many different genres as you so choose. So if it's possible to bring up the second poll, that'll give you some indication. And feel free to scroll down in the poll as well. Now, I don't know if it's possible to have the questions for the second half of that poll before we see the results of the first half. If so, I'll ask my colleagues to put it on the screen whenever they have a minute. One of the major differences that we can see between the US and Europe, not so much on the genres, but well, it does have something to do with the genres, is how, in fact, closer to perceived saturation the US market could be considered to be versus Europe, which might not have quite the breadth of different topics. So from Lauren's standpoint, when you were coming up with ideas for the podcast Spectacular Failures, there's the second half of the poll in case our listeners want to chime in again. So Lauren, how much did you have to do in terms of research of different topics, and how complicated was it to select a genre that would be essentially interesting to the public?
I think that one little caveat for me is that this is not my idea. I mean, I brought it to concept. I created the sort of voice of it, but it had initially been hashed out as a project with, that it predated me. But I can tell you from pitching other shows around that, a lot of podcast studios, and there are many now. There were like none 3 years ago, and now there are so many podcast studios, seemingly with money all over the place. I mean, Pineapple Street, Neon Hum, Wondery, like, take your pick. There are lots, and they kind of have niche areas, but it's hard to tell quite yet. It hasn't all settled, but they have bucket areas of things that they're looking for, and types of shows that they want to fill, or maybe they know that advertisers are really interested in getting on particular types of shows, and so they look for that. There are a lot of interesting sort of cross-pollination partnerships with different production studios and other media companies. So it's really hard to tell right now. I mean, you can look in the market and you can say, what isn't out there? And I'm sure you will find a lot of things. I mean, there was no business narrative show about big business collapse. Like, it didn't exist. We're the only one. Like, now there are a couple of other shows that are similar. And our show was very successful in our first run, and so there are a couple, I wouldn't say copycats, that's ungenerous, but there are a few that have a similar tone. I think the ceiling's still really high up there, because even though there are a million podcasts, it doesn't mean that even a fraction of those are good or interesting to anybody. And also, there are as many podcasts as there are interests that people have, right? Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I'm not going to say we might be at a saturation point, or we might be close to it in terms of who gets funding for really big projects, mm-hmm. And who has access to get that funding. But in terms of sort of just making your own thing, that's saying, like, how saturated is YouTube? Like, mm-hmm.
Nick, from your perspective, is Europe in general, is it just a few years behind in terms of the trends we see around the way podcasts are produced and sort of the whole mechanics, the sausage making, the ways that podcasts are selected by larger organizations, or are we moving in a direction that's similar to what we see in the US, or is it really still very much a function of the established, more, let's say, public sector media companies?
Yeah, I think the sort of underlying trends that are driving and have driven the growth in the US are the same in Europe. It's just happened slower. So, the underlying trends being the amazing headphones we now have, the smartphone. I mean, this is really what led to the sort of revival in the last sort of 5 or 6 years in audio. It's that lack of friction. It's the fact that it fits into young people's lifestyles, and it's the quality of the content. You know, it's that virtuous cycle which you particularly got in the US. And what that's really about is digital first. It's podcast first content. You know, the type that Lauren makes. So it's not, you know, stuff that's just cut off the radio and then just turned into an on-demand podcast. It's stuff where you really think about shows that are going to work in that on-demand medium. And that's really what there's much less of in Europe. I mean, it's really just beginning. So Lauren talked about the independent studios. We analysed the top 200 podcasts in 5 countries, including European ones in the US. We found that 20% of the top shows in the US came from those independent studios like Wondery and the others, Gimlet, etc. Whereas that was about 7% in France. So the vast majority in France come from the public broadcasters, broadcasters. Whereas in the US, it's a mix of, you know, broadcasters like NPR, it's print organizations like the New York Times, it's the independent studios, and it's individuals, you know, or people with small production companies of their own who are creating these giant podcasts like Joe Rogan or whatever. So we don't really have a lot of that. We also don't have a lot of you know, opinionated partisan chat in podcast land yet, though I'm sure that is coming. In Europe, that's very much an American invention, and some of those programs are also gathering a big audience here in Europe. So yeah, I think a lot of differences, a lot of similarities.
Mm-hmm. I'm wondering whether the fact that there is essentially such a free market for podcasts in the U.S., even at, you know, more traditionally what is called public media in the U.S., which differs a little bit from the way public media is structured in Europe. But I'm wondering whether that has encouraged people to be perhaps more creative in finding ideas. But at the same time, you know, there are ultimately journalists and podcast hosts and producers have to earn a living. So is that the flip side, and is it sustainable as a profession to be involved in podcasting, generally speaking? So perhaps Lauren, in the U.S., what's your take on how the industry is evolving?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is, and there are a lot of income streams, I think. I mean, there's the sort of Patreon, you know, you have an independent show and people pay you $5 a month to be sort of in your Patreon, and, you know, and you make a living that way. There are a lot of people out there like that. You know, there are people, there are independent producers who cobble together a living by doing lots of different projects. You know, there are people who, I mean, I get paid a salary and it's a totally livable, reasonable salary. I think that there are a lot of people who can make money off of it. You know, here's my, I think because we're in this very early stage, like, everyone talks about monetization, but I also think that, like, the vast majority of podcasts that are out there in the marketplace are hobby podcasts.
Mm-hmm.
And there's nothing wrong with that. Like, you need people to be out there making creative stuff that's just for them or just for their friends or whatever. Like, everything doesn't have to be a moneymaker. I always say, like, I like playing tennis, but it doesn't mean I want to be, like, going to Wimbledon, you know? Like, I'm not trying to, like, get a sponsorship deal. Like, I suck at tennis, you know? But I enjoy it. And so I think all the talk around monetization is, like, we jumped from, like, something that is fun to do to, you know, I have to make money off of this thing. I realize I'm in a very rarefied place to be able to say that, because it's how I make my living, but it also does strip out a lot of the joy when you have a million deadlines, when you have advertisers breathing down your neck, and when, you know, you're trying to book studios and do all this stuff. I mean, it's very hectic. And so, I mean, I think, like, yes, if you want it to be a job, you can totally make a living at it. But it also means that you have to wade through a lot to get there, I think, because at least to be noticed, or, you know, because it is quite competitive now.
You mentioned to us when we were preparing for today's conversation that Hollywood is interested in podcasts, and that might present some interesting challenges for IP or even monetization too, in a way.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it is a route for monetization, but I think then the problem is it ends up being kind of like a bonanza, where, you know, everyone's just interested in scooping up everything to make a movie or a TV show or something like that, which is nice if you want to make money, but it also creates some challenges because then the medium doesn't get to evolve as its own discrete thing. It just feels like it's a pipeline for something else that's bigger. But who knows? I mean, maybe it'll point people back in the direction of podcasts if they know that it originated, if a movie originated from a podcast. I don't know. I mean, you know, we could all give answers right now and then in 2 months it'll be different. So
I think
yeah, Nick?
Podcasting used to be, you know, there's a lot of purists in podcasting. You know, I'm a podcaster. I do podcasts probably, but it's kind of a hobbyist thing. You know, money's a bit dirty. You know, and that's what's changed. You know, you've suddenly got big money coming in, particularly at the top end. So I mean,
huge money.
It's the Netflixization of podcasting. At the top end, you've got these sort of huge, we call them blockbuster, you know, documentaries, and they are, you know, they've got huge marketing budgets behind them. They cost a lot of money. They take years to plan. They're often going out in multiple languages now, and there's huge rewards for getting those things right. It's like a hits business, you know, the same thing as Netflix, series 1, series 2. Can you create a franchise? Can you turn it into television? You know, all of that. At the other end, you've got, you know, podcasters that I was talking to in Kenya who have absolutely no way of making money out of podcasting. There's no advertising in Kenya at all, no monetization. But the way they monetize it is they sell tickets for the podcast, and people come and see them. So it's like they're making money out of a physical event. So, you know, as Lauren was saying, there's many, many different ways to support podcasters, right from the sort of huge money at the top end through to sort of more supporting and much smaller scale podcasting at the other end. And I think what's interesting is, you know, what happens in the middle, and what does that do to podcasting, and what does that do to the heart, if you like, of podcasting.
One thing I'd look to mention is podcasts made for companies, which is a huge market in the US. A lot of podcast studios have a creative arm, and they are making podcasts for Nike and Whole Foods and name your brand. There are a million branded podcasts out there, which allows a lot more people to have jobs that way. But it's an interesting, the sort of infotainment element of it, and the sort of obscuring of the bounds of, you know, is this journalism? Is this reporting? Is this an ad? Like, what am I getting? You know? And so but I think companies are obsessed now with podcasts. It's like, oh, we got to get on that. And, you know, and I don't know if that's a big thing in Europe yet, the sort of branded content, but I think that purists like me are skeptical in ways, because you're not entirely certain how it's going to play out.
Nick, you were about to say something about that.
Yeah, we are seeing some of the same trends, and I'm skeptical like you, because I think the difference is that it's really hard to find an audience unless you have something that has real high authenticity, and you can kind of see through that. So I think you're right. I think podcasts are so sort of on trend that all of the you know, all the companies basically, I want my own podcast, and it's really, and then they find it's really hard. It's really hard to build that audience. So,
and of course, the selection of the genre of podcasts might be influenced by the corporate sponsor. But before we get to that stage, let's take a look at the results on the genres that were polled and how in our small sample. So we see arts and culture quite high, government and politics, not so much for leisure and kids and family and history. Okay, that seems to go with the information that you mentioned. And then the second tranche of the, there we go. Exactly as you said, Nick, news and current affairs seem to have increased quite a bit over the last few months. And true crime, and I had a question about true crime, because that's a genre that's being developed quite actively. There's an interest in crime worldwide. It's not just the US. There's a very developed true crime and fiction, crime fiction history in many European countries. That's something we haven't really seen that many podcasts in Europe on those, although it is starting slightly. Is there a market for that in Europe? I know, for example, Lauren's a big fan of British mysteries. But,
well, I should note that I am a fan of books, that mystery books. True crime, I find it challenging to. It's hard to make entertainment. It's hard for me to take a crime where somebody is killed or raped or something and make it into entertainment. But I also know that it is explosive and there is a never-ending trough from which to feed on. But Nick, is it an exploding genre in Europe?
Yeah, and it's definitely, this is not just an American thing. I mean, we in Scandinavian countries, Nordic countries, you have a lot of true crime, and some of the biggest podcasts have been true crime podcasts. When we did our analysis last year, we found that something like 50% of the top podcasts in Australia were basically true crime. So you have all the newspapers making them, the Australian and the Sydney Morning Herald, in addition to the television networks. Everyone has piled in. You've had explosive hits like Teacher's Pet in Australia. Interestingly, a little bit less in the UK, but again, that we've seen true crime or historical events, revisited by the BBC amongst others. So yeah, I mean, this is, there's no question, this appeals across demographics as well. Appeals to women as well as to men, more to women than men.
This leads us to our third major topic, which is how is podcasting going to look like in the future? What are some of the new formats, the new genres? How is the business model going to evolve? I'm wondering, so, when does a podcast in a way stop being a podcast? Is if it contains fiction, if it includes video? Are we expanding the definition of podcast? And is there more blended? Is there a more blended nature that is afoot here?
I wish we had a better name than podcast. It is truly the worst. It's just it's like, every time you're like, I'm a podcast host, it's embarrassing to say, because people are like, that's a job. Yeah, it is. So yeah, I mean, it is this catch-all, Oliver, as you noted. I mean, but all it is it's digital audio, right? It's audio you can take with you that is not music, and it's not an audiobook. I think that there is huge room to grow in audio fiction. And it started, I think, in this sort of science fiction genre, and it has moved into a different realm. I mean, there are podcast musicals now, which is it's a perfect medium for a musical, but it has to be written in a very specific way because it's only for your ears. I think there's lots of space for that. And we see increasingly celebrities getting into audio dramas, particularly now in Corona times where they can't film on a movie set. I mean, every celebrity I feel like has a podcast now in America. I don't know why, because I'm like, why does anybody care what Demi Moore has to say at this point? But there you go. But I think there's a lot of money in podcast audio dramas, which is funny because it just goes right back to where radio started, right? Which is in the audio drama. But sure, I mean, there are as many future genres as there is creativity out there, right? I'm sure that there are things we can't even think about that could be harnessed using, in the audio format. And I think Nick had noted, better speakers, these sort of voice command, Alexa type things. Like, I think that will just expand and expand.
Yeah, Nikki, actually that dovetails into the next question I had, which is about the technology and how changes to the technology, because roughly speaking, podcasting from a listener standpoint has not changed much over the last 15 years at all, right? So what's in store in terms of new tech to help make podcasting even more popular?
Yeah, and I think, podcasts very much, we have to remember it comes out of, Apple, the iPod, that's where the name came from, and until recently about 80% of all consumption was via Apple devices. So I mean, the big change is this is not going to be about podcasts. I agree with Lawrence Drift. I think over time it's going to disappear. It's not going to disappear quickly, but I think within 10 years we'll just be talking about audio on demand. That's really what.
Yeah, we don't say talkies anymore.
No. This is really a revolution in diversity of voice within audio. It's about the wonders of audio that is unleashed from the radio, that is not confined to having to listen to it on a fixed set, that is mobile, that is accessible through voice in all these new ways. And so we're nowhere near the end of the audio revolution. I think when we talk to people in focus groups, they talk about wanting to get away from screens. And one of the reasons they say they love audio is because of that intimacy, because they can really get into something in depth and sort of not be stacking all the time. So they are doing that, of course, but they feel bad about doing that, and they really like the way in which audio can often get you away from that and get you to something deeper and more meaningful. And I think that will massively expand from where we are. I agree about audiobooks and audio fiction. I think that is already a huge thing. At the other end, I think we're going to see short form audio, so voice devices. Tell me more about coronavirus, or what are today's statistics in terms of how many died in my neighborhood. Others are facilitating that. And I think the platforms themselves are really going to be the drivers of this, as we've seen elsewhere. Spotify, Google, and others, they develop products for audio. There were no products for audio. Audio was invisible. So radio was completely undisrupted. That's changing. There are audio players coming out all over the place. Spotify has now taken on the spoken word. You have mixed, automated algorithmic playlists that include and mix music and short form audio. I mean, the possibilities are endless. And we won't be able to talk about podcasts anymore because there will be so many different ways of accessing it.
Absolutely. Well, these are trends that we're seeing on the horizon. One of them also that I thought I should ask you about is the consolidation among big players and the interest in voice that we see, from the likes of Amazon with Audible a few years ago, and of course the New York Times expanding through acquisition of talent. And Gimlet and selling to Spotify a few years ago. Do you anticipate that those are going to have an impact on the types of podcasts that are produced, as well as the way they're produced?
That's a big question. Yeah,
it's a big question. I think we've seen this before, haven't we? So you've had. With digital, you get a sort of explosion of creativity, and then there isn't enough money to sustain all these companies, and so you get consolidation. You also see platforms. Podcasting, as I say, has not been about platforms because it's only been Apple, and Apple haven't really been interested in sort of developing it commercially. And I think all of that is changing, and that will, of course, change the content. It will change, who wins and who loses. And it's a three-way split. So you've got the platforms, so Spotify and Google and others that want to get into that space, Audible and Amazon, moving into technology like voice devices as well. You've got big print organizations like the New York Times that are investing in audio production studios, people like Vox who are investing in whole networks and commissioning out freelancers and expanding, trying to create huge audio networks and advertising networks. And then you've got the traditional broadcasters as well. This is their core business. And so, NPR, BBC, Swiss Radio, all of these, have the potential to be the winners, but they're unlikely to be the winners because of the power of those platforms. So it's going to be a really interesting sort of tussle between publishers on the one hand, and are they getting the value, are they getting the discovery, all of these things is really going to play out over the next 5 years.
One thing that I think is interesting is the efforts of to put content behind paywalls. Audible, with their sort of original series, original products, have done that. I don't know how successful they are. Luminary was $100 million company here in the U.S. All of its products, all of its original content is behind a paywall, and also, it's also then supposed to be a platform where lots of other, shows live. But it's hard to think about how, things could be behind a paywall when Spotify, there's a free version, and, Apple Podcasts is free, and I can download Pocket Cast, which is the player that I use, and it's free. And, so that's an interesting area. I wonder if it goes the same route as sort of cable TV in the US, where, it just gets sort of, it contracts, and it slowly ends up where you have to pay for everything, or it's an a la carte thing. Like, who knows, really?
Yeah, go ahead, Nick.
These are great questions, and I think we don't know the answer to that, but I think it's very likely, podcast started as free and ad-supported, and with no money and ad-supported, but we're definitely going to get mixed models and hybrid models here, and that's what's going to change very quickly. I think that the vast majority will continue to be free. The CPMs on podcast advertising remain pretty high if you have significant numbers. So for most, like the New York Times, for example, it doesn't make much sense to put the daily behind a paywall. Basically, they're using it to find new subscribers and to sort of cross-promote into their subscription product. But other publishers in Europe are already started experiments in putting behind a paywall. We have organizations like Slate that put out stuff for free and then do bonus episodes as part of Slate Plus, which is their premium service, and that is delivering some of the highest conversions to their entire paid product. So podcasts are, because of the loyalty, because of the connection, are great ways to drive subscription, even if only only small proportion of them are going to be behind a paywall. And then the other thing that Lauren mentioned is, it is probably going to be more like a cable model. We're already seeing Joe Rogan, for example, signing exclusively to Spotify. You'll only be able to get him on Spotify, and you don't have to be a subscriber. You can still go through the free version, but you're going to see alignment between platforms and the really content, or the stuff that bring top people, not particularly around news, but definitely around entertainment and personality.
Mm-hmm. All these are fascinating aspects, and I wish we could spend longer on that specific topic. I wanted to open up to a few questions from our viewers and our listeners. There's one that's been asked already, which is how much, so just a reminder, you can use the Q&A tool in your Zoom in order to ask those questions. One question we got from another source is, how much of an impact do you think podcasts have on larger social, political, or economic issues, given that it's a newer medium? And in particular, there's an example cited how certain podcasts, I think it's called In the Dark, affected court cases that are seen before the US Supreme Court. So is there a power that is specific to podcasting that is perhaps an outsized power compared to other media, or how do you see that?
I don't think so. Also, In the Dark comes from my shop, and it is a singular show that has done enormous good. I highly recommend everybody listen to it. it's really something else if you're interested in learning about the U.S. justice system. But yeah, I just lost the thread of what the question was. I'm too busy promoting our own thing.
No, wondering if
and
it
the
has an
outsized
impact.
influence. I don't actually think so, because the listenership is small and it's of a particular demographic, right? It's a particular socioeconomic bracket. It is like, we don't have as many listeners of color. We don't have as many lower income listeners. Like, I don't think that you can have, I don't think that you can have the full influence, of, say, something on television or whatnot if you have such a small listenership. I mean, In the Dark was an outlier, I think. Mm-hmm. I mean, maybe Nick, you have a different opinion on that, but not at least what I've seen.
I think it's interesting. I mean, we basically haven't seen a lot of the same, hyper partisan or many of the dangers that we've seen with social media and some blogs with podcasting. I think that's partly the demographics that you talk about. But I think it's also because the rewards are different. The rewards are for quality. You're not rewarding an algorithm in the same way as you are with YouTube or with Facebook. And so I think, although that's coming, the most listened to podcasts like the New York Times Daily, 3 million a day, these are broadly traditional media companies. So it's rewarding quality at the top end. It's not rewarding anger or partisanship yet. That may change.
Right, and if you look at sort of popular shows, I mean, in the U.S., like, right-wing shows are not, they don't get the same kind of traction or purchase. It's like, it feels to me like a very upper middle class, liberal kind of enterprise. And I know that's not true, because I know that our listenership sort of cuts across. But yeah, it's hard to tell what the influence is of the medium quite yet, I think.
Another question we had concerns sort of the cultural and the international power of podcasts. I know anecdotally, for example, that at least one Swiss podcast in French was getting a larger proportion of international listenership than did other types of more traditional media from that same organization. Is there a way, do you think that, first of all, is it something that podcasters pay attention to, given that the revenue model might not be built in a way that to remunerate what they're doing from international listeners? And conversely, is there a consciousness among governments that there's a cultural power to export, or let's say soft power to export podcasts to international audiences?
Maybe I'll have a go at that. So I think, I mean, if you look at the government or state broadcasters or European broadcasters that try and reach foreign audiences in different languages, this is absolutely critical to their strategy right now. It's about essentially reaching the next generation in a format where they're going to listen. They're not going to listen to shortwave or AM radio. Young people under 35 don't do that. So if they're going to get people, then it is through the on-demand medium, and that's why you're seeing so much investment. And obviously from RT and the Russian and Chinese are trying to do the same thing. So if you're in that business, I think for others, it's primarily a national thing, like everything else. The internet enables you to get international audiences. And I already mentioned, some of the big blockbusters that the US studios are producing are very much done with an international audience in mind because of the monetization potential. But in general, if you talk about the news shows, the news is very country specific, and most of the people who listen to the Daily are in the US, though there is a lot of people in the UK who listen to the Daily as well, but it's kind of a bit more marginal. So I think it depends on the genre, but like other forms of the internet, you take away the geographical boundaries with podcasting. In theory, you can reach niches and areas of interest anywhere in the world.
I mean, we know. Yeah. I think I had mentioned before in our prep that, I mean, we get pretty detailed demographics and psychographics of all of our listeners and where they come from. I mean, we can drill into a lot of data, which is great. And we do know that, you know, we have international listeners. They certainly are not the core of our listenership, but I think that that has helped us in how we write the show, right? Which is that we don't assume that our listener is American and that they know everything about the US, and or that, like, we're not just talking to other Americans. I think that's really important, as, you know, obviously there aren't, the only boundaries would be language and access to technology, but it's not, you know, it's a medium where a lot of people can get it if they want it. And so I think not necessarily for us focusing on international audiences, but recognizing that what we make is being consumed by people elsewhere is important, and not just sort of catering to, you know, Steve down the street.
Yeah. We have one last question from the audience that we'll take. As more podcast production houses pop up with more money going behind commercial podcasts, how do you see the path forward for smaller independent podcasts that are run by one or two people?
Oh, good luck. Just kidding.
Sorry, yeah, Nick, you were about to say, add something.
I think we're also seeing the development of infrastructure that allows donation models to work really well. I mean, Laura mentioned this already with Patreon, but it's not just Patreon. You know, small payments, tipping, micropayments, all of these kind of things are possible. And then tapping into, you know, as Spotify provided for smaller publishers, and other networks have, you know, the programmatic advertising. But you're obviously going to need numbers to make that work. So I think it's going to be more about small groups of people who feel very passionately about a subject. I think there'll be a business model for that too. You won't get rich, but there'll be a business model for it.
Yeah, and it's also interesting because everybody has access, every creator has access to put their work on a platform that everybody else can get. I mean, whether people listen to it, who knows? But it's a nice thing because, like, I can't just put anything I want up on TV, you know? I mean, YouTube obviously has changed that, but and obviously, you know, there's Vimeo for movies and such, but I do think it is much more democratized, seemingly, because the cost of it is very low compared to the other media. I mean, like, my gear and the cost of making what we make is quite high, but, like, if you just want to have a talker with your friend, you know, you could get in the gate with less than $200, you know, and it's pretty low barrier of entry, which is great. But it doesn't mean, you know, like Nick said, like, you're not going to be like swimming in cash. But I mean, who knows? Like, maybe all the big shops will get tapped out of, you know, boring ideas from professional producers, and they'll, you know, be more open to indie routes. Who knows?
It's all a big cycle, it seems. These things tend to ebb and flow, as we've seen throughout the conversation and the history of podcasting. I'm delighted that we had a chance to talk about these issues, and your insights were really wonderful. I'll ask for one last thing as we've run out of time, but that is, what is your podcast recommendation for something that you haven't been that hasn't been produced by you or your organization? Is there anything that's in your podcast feed right now that you recommend to our listeners?
I am currently listening to the show Wind of Change from Pineapple Street Media and Crooked Media, and there's some other producer of that. Who knows? There's like 900 companies. It is a story about whether or not the song Wind of Change by the German band Scorpions was actually written by the CIA as a pro-democracy tool. And it's done by the journalist Patrick Radden Keefe. and it is extraordinarily well researched, and it sounds great, and it totally transports you to that time. And I'm halfway through it, and I think it's great.
Wonderful. Thank you for the recommendation, Nick.
I'd recommend, I've been listening to Tunnel 29, which was a podcast put out by the BBC, relates to what happened in the early 1960s in Berlin, and it's about people escaping from the east to the west. And it's just, what's great about it is just the way each episode is constructed, and the narrative storytelling, the suspense that goes through it, the development of the characters, and I think, it's the sort of thing that if you're going on a long car journey, you listen to one episode and the next episode, and before you know it, you finish the whole thing.
Wonderful.
If I could just say one thing about that, it is basically about tunneling under the Berlin Wall, and the way that they do the sound design makes you feel like you are in a tunnel getting, it is collapsing around you. I mean, it's very atmospheric. Kudos to the folks who made it, because it is very anxiety producing, and I think that's what they were going for.
Wonderful. Thanks for both of those recommendations. I'll add mine, which is a podcast in French called Washington, D.C., and D.C. is spelled D''ICI, which means from here, and it's essentially, so it's a pun, and it's radio correspondence from the French-speaking radios of Canada, of Radio Canada, RTBF from Belgium, Radio France Internationale, and the Swiss RTS that are based in Washington, D.C., and they talk about current events going on in D.C. So it's a French-speaking international perspective on Washington, D.C.'s comings and goings and the current crazy moment we are living in. And it's very entertaining, and it's done by seasoned journalists. So that's my recommendation. With that, we've gone a little bit over our allotted time. I apologize to our speakers and also our viewers and listeners. We hope you'll join us for future editions of the new Media Mixer. It's been a pleasure to have you both, Lauren Ober and Nick Newman, for this edition. I thank you very much and wish you a lovely end of your week.